welcome to the AT&T CyberThreat Report. This is March 1st, 2012. Joining us today, we have John Hogoboom. John is one of our security analysts. He's a software developer. He does a lot of our analysis tools. Welcome, John, and what do you plan to discuss with us today?
Hey, Brian. Today I've got an article that came out about DNS being used for botnet command and control. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and some of the other things that we've seen similar to that. And also have the spam report, which we'll go over and see what kind of trends that we've been seeing there as well.
All righty, sounds good. We have Jim Clausing with us today. Jim Clausing is one of our lead malware analysts. He's also an interface to the Internet security community as well. Welcome, Jim. And what do you plan to discuss today?
Thanks, Brian. Today I want to talk about a report that came out earlier this week surveying the state of IPv6 and its handling of fragmentation, which was the ways of evading intrusion detection in our world. So we'll talk about what's happening with that in IPv6.
That should be interesting. You know, we probably should be discussing more things about IPv6 and the security ramifications associated with that because, as you know, I guess IPv6 is going to be officially turned on the Internet. I think is it June 6th? Is that correct?
That's World IPv6 Day is June 6th, yes.
Yeah, so, you know, as folks here are well aware, we've been working really hard to make sure our analysis tools are up to date. A lot of the infrastructure for the network is done, but the analysis tools are a challenge in themselves for IPv6, so absolutely interested in that topic. I'm Brian Rexroad, and I am going to be hosting for the web report, the Internet Weather Report, excuse me. And I also have a couple of topics to discuss here today. One is related to denial of service attacks. There was a little article that came out that indicated that perhaps a lot of the denial of service attacks are launched for competitive reasons. So we'll chat about that a little bit. And another topic which is related to DNS, near and dear to my heart. And this is related to some suggestions for preventing domain name hijacking. I think there are a couple of pretty good suggestions here. We can talk about that as well. So without any further delay here, let's shift over to John here and talk a little bit about, yes, DNS, but in another context, how it can be used in a bad way, I suppose.
All right, yeah, thanks, Brian. So we got a report recently that was published regarding certain malware using DNS as a command and control channel. In this particular article, there's no specific family of malware mentioned here, just that there's been an increase in this type of activity. And basically what that means is, you know, traditionally we've seen command and control using either HTTP, IRC, even peer-to-peer type things, but a lot of those have somewhat fixed endpoints where you know where all these botted machines are going to go to. Peer-to-peer is maybe an exception, but you can kind of get a feel for where they're going. With DNS, it's really interesting that you can embed records inside DNS, inside your DNS record, so that it responds with some kind of command activity to the querying bot. And the way the interesting part about that is the way the command and control works is your bot is really going to talk to your DNS server or whatever traditional DNS server it's configured to talk to. So from a network monitoring standpoint, it's kind of difficult to pick up where the actual command and control is happening because, in a sense, it's getting kind of proxied and rerouted through DNS caching resolvers along the way between you and the actual command and control. And we've seen this before. Mordo, the Mordo worm, which was, I believe, an RDP, remote desktop protocol type worm. We had seen in that one where they did this exact thing, and if you look, it's a little hard to see this slide, but in the TXT records, they embedded some encoded commands in here. They're obviously not readable. I think we actually have a understanding of how this is encoded, but I didn't get a chance to decode it. But if you were able to decode it, it would actually have an instruction in there that could be responded. Here's another example from one of the other controllers at a different time. There was also another botnet that used DNS in another way, similar, not similar, but in a little different tactic. Roostock at one point, when it was right before it was shut down, it had kind of done some tactics to help avoid shutdown. And what it was doing is when you would look up the domain name for one of the Roostock controllers, you get an IP address back. But that was not the IP address that your piece of affected software, your malware, would try to contact. It would run that returned IP address through a hashing algorithm, get a real IP address from that, and then go contact that. So for a lot of us security analysts, a lot of times we use just traditional DNS. We look up the address. We get an IP address back. We don't know necessarily that we need to hash it. So this was really a good evasive technique for a while, even though it did get shut down ultimately by Microsoft back in 2011.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, John. Could we go back just briefly for a moment? And I wanted to talk a little bit about this this command and control channel here, because if I remember correctly, it sounded like I think this was sort of a clumsy command and control that it wasn't very easy to change. You'd have to overcome the caching, which it looks like the time to live there was merely 900 seconds, but a little bit slow in terms of what you could do in terms of command control. Is that correct?
Right. It was, from what this is saying, it is about 900 seconds, which I guess is, what is that, 15 minutes or something like that?
Something like that.
And I'm not sure about this one below if they changed that. That has a 58, so it might only be 60 seconds. But I guess it depends on how, IRC was really, that was a real traditional command and control because it was so interactive. You could really control all of your bots down to the nanosecond to initiate some kind of activity. Whereas even with HTTP, you're going to have to engage in some kind of polling type mechanism, which may or may not be very frequent. And as we've seen, there are a bunch that sometimes they're not really polling more than 15 or 20 minutes at a time, right? In between their check-ins with the command and control server. So from this perspective, I don't think DNS is that much different, but I didn't really do a hard study of how this one's working.
Okay, that's fair enough. So you had another type item here that you wanted to show us?
Oh, yeah. So I just wanted to mention some of the other interesting aspects or nefarious uses that we've seen of DNS in the past. One of them is using DNS as a covert exfiltration channel. So we've theorized about this, or we had been theorizing. We've seen cases of this where they will, I've seen cases where in the leading half of the domain name, so let's say it's whatever botnet.org or something, the whatever piece, they'll make a really long encrypted encoded piece, and they can actually start sending information out by changing that in iterative queries. It's a slow method, but it'll work. You can actually exfiltrate certain amounts of data. Certainly, we've seen them exfiltrate machine names, things about the system that they've infected is exfiltrated out in that manner.
So this is a case where, if I remember correctly, the data itself is encoded as effectively the host name with a domain name suffix, and then as each time that host name is put in there as a part of the query, is the leftmost part of the domain that's being queried. It fails the caching server because the caching server hasn't seen that domain name before, so it goes through the recursion process, and ultimately that information gets to a DNS server operated by the bad guy, right?
Right. It gets to the authoritative DNS server, and then it can respond specifically to that one as well, because it knows which one that is by looking at the hostname portion. It can give a specific instruction if it wants to back.
Yep.
So that's an interesting use of that, kind of related, similar to what we were talking about before, but it's just another way of kind of pushing data out as well as receiving data in a way that DNS wasn't really meant to be used. Hashed IP address DNS response, we talked about that one in Roostock. We also know botnets and APT in particular use DNS in ways that can be identified. They tend to, especially APT, as we've seen, it tends to use DNS in a very specific victim-oriented way. And then DNS amplification tax is another nefarious use. A lot of people know about that. I know you've been talking about DNSSEC and some worries that DNSSEC might not be such a great thing when it's used as an amplification vector for DNS attack or, reflection type attacks. So I think you're right.
It does seem to exacerbate the problem of DNS amplification attacks, and so hopefully we'll be able to find some good recommendations to get out into the internet community to help to alleviate that problem. Absolutely.
All right.
One of the other things that just came to mind here, we've got analysis techniques for identifying things like transient domains and fast flux domains as well. So, I think what this really is kind of leading toward is that you really need to be taking a look at what DNS is doing and how it's being used. I think that was sort of the essence of the article that you brought up at the beginning of this. That is, we shouldn't be ignoring DNS. There are all kinds of things that where it's being abused for various reasons and for various objectives. And from an enterprise point of view, it's sort of a hole in the firewall, so to speak, that we need to pay attention to.
Right. And if you're a large enterprise or even a mid-sized one and you're not monitoring your DNS activity, strongly encourage you to do so. You're going to find all sorts of interesting things happening that you're completely unaware of that, DNS would let you know about by looking at what logs you have there.
Yeah, absolutely. We've done a lot of research into this and developing algorithms, and, like the DNS amplification attack, we have an algorithm for detecting that we've been had in place for some time now, and that activity is going on regularly, identifying a lot of these other nefarious behaviors. We've done a lot of development and research on those as well, and have a number of those algorithms working in production. So, very good, John. Thank you.
Sure.
On the next topic here, what I'll do is just we're going to talk a little bit about denial of service attacks. Okay, so this is actually a blog that was posted. It's actually, I think, posted by an organization called Choreo. They make products that are support. They may do other security products as well, but they have security products that are intended to help with remediation of denial of service attacks. They apparently have done a survey of a number of companies. They didn't say specifically how they selected those companies for the survey. It may have been random, or it may have been folks that were volunteered or visited their website or something along those lines. But they had a couple of interesting observations, and you can go and take a look at the article yourself. The URL is here. But probably the most significant is they noted that at least in terms of what the results of the survey, there were a lot of organizations, particularly in the U.S., that felt that they were being attacked, that the denial of service attacks that they had experienced were launched by their competitors, that their competitors were trying to gain an unfair business advantage by using denial of service attacks. Now, clearly denial of service attacks are an illegal activity, so that's kind of curious. And again, I'm not sure if this was actually based on fact or if it's merely a perception of the folks that were surveyed. It didn't go into those details, but it's an interesting, at least perception at the very least, that a number of organizations feel that their competitors are trying to use denial of service attacks to attack them. Another one that they noted here was that a fifth of those enterprises reporting at least one attack said ideological or political motives were to blame. We probably, most of us are quite aware of a pretty prominent organization that does that, Anonymous. They have been launching denial of service attacks. My personal observation has been that those denial of service attacks are much more exaggerated in the media than they have been actually effective. And, we do provide a denial of service protection service as a part of the service we provide at AT&T. We provide that to customers, and a number of customers have been targeted by those attacks. But as I said, most of those attacks are generally short-lived and not particularly large, although perhaps they do send a message. And then a third sort of notable item here, 38% of U.S. enterprises surveyed reported at least one denial of service attack in the past year. That's a pretty big number, and more than 40% of those said that they had been hit with multiple attacks, so they had experienced it multiple times. Just to put that in perspective, my personal experience has been that in analyzing attacks or claims where an organization has been under a denial of service attack, and this is not a scientific study here, this is just a perception of my own, I've seen perhaps half of those have been cases where there's another explanation for the situation. That is, it could have been a system was configured improperly, a routing loop, or some type of a misconfiguration that caused a flooding event, or simply just an outage that is convenient to blame it on somebody else, but it may in fact have been some sort of a problem. Notwithstanding, there certainly are a lot of other denial of service attacks. There are the ones that we mitigate, those that are associated with customers that have asked us for assistance. There's certainly a lot of others that I would describe as going unnoticed, and oftentimes they're actually cases where, folks that are doing gaming or something are trying to disrupt each other using what, again, is an illegal activity. Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts of this from the group here? I think it was an interesting little blog. Again, we don't have the raw information here to be able to substantiate the accuracy of the statements or how the survey was conducted, but nevertheless, some interesting observations, and certainly DDoS attacks are one of the things that we want to be concerned about.
Yeah, numbers.
Yes, Jim.
But, denial of services act that we see on a regular basis, it seems to work at least for short periods of time, so guys continue to do it.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, and I know we used to see it a lot more during the holiday season as well, targeting a lot of these online retailers when they're going to do probably 80 to 90% of their entire year's worth of business is during that time. And there's a lot of DDoS attacks that are used for extortion-type purposes, where they say, well, we're going to give you a DDoS, and it's going to happen at this time. Give us $10,000, or next time it's going to, happen and be worse, kind of thing.
Yeah, so, you're right, John. There are some cases like that, and which, incidentally, first of all, you're right. There are some cases like that where extortion is the motive behind it. That is, it seemed like that was more popular in the past. There was mention of that in the article. I didn't include that as one of the notes here, but for folks that are interested, go ahead to that article and take a little closer look. It has some interesting notes. A couple of other comments along those lines. During the holiday season, this is a case where there is a rush of users going to e-commerce sites looking to look through catalogs and purchase things. We've seen cases where it's not a denial of service attack, other than the fact that maybe an advertising campaign was a little too successful and too many people got there at the same time, what we call a flash crowd in the internet sense. And that becomes, in fact, the denial of service attack. That is, the system simply just can't take the load. It wasn't anything nefarious.
Right. They're a victim of their own advertising.
A victim of their own success, so to speak. Yes, absolutely. So, again, I think one of the, it's important to realize the difference between malicious activities and ones that are, have other causes. And the way to do that is have good monitoring tools in place so you recognize what is normal and what what attributes are actually changing that cause a problem to occur.
And give some thought, if online e-commerce is the way that your business survives, you need to be planning ahead for capacity issues. Even the big boys sometimes run into that, so you've got to be, agile and able to add additional servers, to your cloud infrastructure, whatever, when you become a victim of your own success.
Absolutely, good points. Where transactions on the internet are a fundamental part of your business, whether it be a commerce site or some other type of transaction. And also there's, clearly there's the public relations aspect of things, that even if the site is not critical to the business, if it goes away, and that may be a reflection on the the robustness of the business itself. So that's an important attribute to consider. Thanks very much for those comments. And let's go ahead and transition over to you here, Jim, and let's talk a little bit about IPv6.
Thanks, Brian. It's been 14 years now since the seminal paper on IDS and evasion by Hijacking, I think. And one of the attack methods that they described at the time, IDS, was fragmentation of IP packets, and that would allow them to evade network intrusion detection if the IDS didn't necessarily reassemble the packets in the same way the end system did, particularly if you've got overlapping fragments. This is where that really came into be an issue. And there have been a number of attempts to solve that problem, but it's something that the community been aware of for a long time and dealt with in different ways, forcing the reassembly at the firewall, whatever. With IPv6, the question was, are we going to repeat the same mistake that we made with IPv4? And so the RFC 5722 basically was introducing a standard that said you can't have overlapping fragments in IPv6. If you got overlapping fragments, you drop them. You should time out on the reassembly. And just this week, SI6 Networks posted their little survey on how things stand current popular IPv6 TCP stacks or IP stacks, whether or not they've implemented the RFC 5722. And what we see in the table that in this slide here is that it's looking pretty good. OpenBSD 5.0 is the only one there that actually not currently implementing RFC 5722 either implicitly or explicitly by either timing out or explicitly sending back a timeout exceeded in reassembly. So it looks like in the not too near future, overlapping fragment attack won't work anymore in IPv6. Now these are the current versions of these stacks. Still a number of devices out there running older stacks, older versions of the OSs that may still be vulnerable for a while. But this is actually good news that since IPv6, while there's been IPv6 traffic on the internet for a number of years now, stated in the opening, it really hasn't hit critical mass yet. There are a number of sites that have been putting up IPv6 presence. World IPv6 Day last year, a number of them put them up temporarily, put them up for a day just to test things out. The goal of this year's is to put them up and leave them up. So as more and more of the traffic on the internet moves to IPv6, at least we've got a good sign here that this particular attack that has been out there for a number of years won't necessarily work anymore. And the report talks about a couple of other suggested, they're not RFCs yet, but drafts of some other possible ways of fixing some of the similar issues. The one that I have a slide on here is the handling of atomic fragments. Basically, it's possible in IPv6 to have a fragment or an IP packet that has the flag set saying it's fragmented, that it's fragment 0, but that there are no more fragments. And that sounds a little odd. There are legitimate cases where you can get this. This is a listing of how the current stacks handle that as well. And there are a couple of others that they don't go into in too much detail in this report. But it's something that I've been thinking about for quite some time. We've talked about it, not necessarily on the show so much, but exactly what you mentioned at the beginning of the show about the need to be able to monitor IPv6 traffic as that becomes more and more of the traffic on the internet. And so when I happened to notice this report, I thought it was important that we at least mention it and talk about it a little bit.
Forgive me. Help refresh my memory here. I have not got a clear idea what the threat is behind fragmentation. And so what kinds of attacks could be conducted using the fragmentation as a vector?
Well, the big thing, there are a couple of them. One is, if you fragment the attack, the packet up so that if you've got an IDS, an intrusion detection system that looks for signatures in the packet, and you split the packet in the middle of where it might signatures. If the IDS itself isn't reassembling them, then it won't see the attack. Mm-hmm. Even if it is assembling them, there are a number of different ways that you could reassemble them if the fragments overlap, so that you could use the first piece of it and then this piece of it. Part that overlaps in the middle, you can, if the IDS looks at the part of it that was in the first packet, but the end host looks at the part that was in the second packet, then what the IDS is seeing and what the end host is seeing are two completely different things, and so the IDS might think it's benign while it's actually attacked. Yeah. Those are the two classic ones.
Okay, that's a very good explanation. Thank you. That helps me understand it much better. And the other thing, I think, kind of the essence of of this entire discussion here, you mentioned at the beginning, is that we don't want to relive all the mistakes that occurred in creating IPv4 as we transition to IPv6. And there was actually sort of as IPv6 was introduced into some of the operating systems, I recall that there were a number of vulnerabilities that had been identified, and hopefully those have been pretty much worked out at this point. But I personally believe that as IPv6 gets used more, we're going to probably discover more of those latent sort of, perhaps not repeats of history, but certainly vulnerabilities, in fact, possibly vulnerabilities that have been reintroduced into IPv4 that haven't been discovered yet. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but that's at least my impression of the situation.
Yeah, if we wanted to spend a half hour discussing this, I could go into a lot of...
Yeah, absolutely. But it's nice to hear a good piece of news here that there are folks that are paying close attention to not repeating history, and the tests show that we're in a pretty good position so far.
Yep.
All righty. Let's go ahead and the next thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit here, I'll go ahead and take the reins again, and we'll talk a little bit about DNS hijacking, now, or domain name hijacking in particular. And this is specifically an article that I ran across. It was in PC World, and you can go out and visit it. The URL is on the page here. it was basically talking about 4 ways to prevent domain name hijacking. It talked about, some of the threats associated with DNS and a few other things here, and there were 4 sort of tangible things that would be worthwhile talking about there. First of all, they didn't say this specifically, but my interpretation of it was that they're basically recommending strong authentication. I think that is an absolutely important characteristic. And then what they're talking about here is requiring and using strong authentication from your access to your domain name service provider. That is, this is presuming that somebody else is providing your domain name services, and you need to be able to log in to create new subdomains or to be able to change how domain names resolve. And if you have a situation like that, many organizations do, you want to make sure that you have strong authentication. That is, you want to make sure that nobody else can log in as you and obviously change things, because these are this is a vector that's more often than not used as a means to redirect domain names to nefarious sites, perhaps as a phishing thing. Oftentimes it's just simply as a defacing activity.
Yeah, well, and that authentication actually has to be with your registrar as well.
Yes, which may be, in fact, the same organization, but you're absolutely correct about that.
Right, because you could just go to the registrar and change the name servers on your record and point to rogue name servers, and now everybody's going, then it's almost out of your control. You can't even fix it.
And we've seen that actually happen in practice a few times, where people have, for some reason or another, lost, at the registrar level, lost control, and so their authoritative name servers for their domain ended up being repointed to.
Yes. Yeah, so there are lots of examples where the domain name service provider just had weaknesses. Strong authentication is the one that was basically alluded to in this article. I would tend to extend it. I tend to be sort of an advocate that I think there should be some base standards, particularly for high-value type services. So if you have domain names associated with, we talked about e-commerce type activities, certainly ones that would be associated with PCI transactions, for example, payment card industry. I believe there should be some requirements on the domain name service providers that provide those authoritative domains in terms of the security of the infrastructure that they're providing, the authentication mechanisms for accessing and changing domain names, any validation associated with that. But so, needless to say, that's the first recommendation here. Second one is they recommend keeping up to date on security patches on your web servers. I didn't quite understand how that relates to this, other than certainly if you're concerned about defacement of your website, you want to make sure you have a secure website, and there's perhaps will be things in terms of being able to redirect users if your website is compromised to other types of sites and that type of thing. I don't think that's exactly a domain name hijacking issue, but it certainly could look like one.
Well, and if you keep up to date with the security patches on your DNS servers themselves, that would be a big deal.
Absolutely, yes, and a good point there. This article was a little different than that, but and then the next item was to monitor where your site traffic is going. I thought that seems obvious when you read it, but I don't think there are many organizations that do that. I think that was a very good recommendation. So. That's something I'd like to investigate a little bit further about seeing how that is done. Now, there are cases where the hijacking, if it's not done actually at your authoritative name servers or whoever is providing your authoritative name servers, some of that redirection might be local. So there was actually a case in Brazil where an insider at the ISP was apparently paid off to do something. This person has since been arrested, but for a 10-month period, he was redirecting users from a legitimate site to a nefarious site where they were actually infecting the user's machines as sort of a drive-by download. And that infection was in fact used for bank fraud later on. So it was purported in the press originally as a DNS, actually a DNS cache poisoning. It turned out that it was actually sort of a hijacking, a localized hijacking in that particular case, but that's one of these cases where monitoring where your traffic could be is going would be helpful, but it doesn't necessarily completely accomplish the problem. Okay, and then the last recommendation that they had here was to request DNSSEC from your registrar. And I think, this is certainly having that capability. I think I'm in support of signing your domain names. It gives you some options for doing things. We talked about it a little bit earlier in the program. I do have some concerns about the DNS amplification issue and how it is exacerbated by DNSSEC. We'll be working through those types of issues as we go forward. The validation process for DNSSEC is still a little unclear to me on how it can be done in a prudent manner, but that would be something at least perhaps talking with your registrar about DNSSEC at this point. And that covers that topic. I guess what we'll go and do next here is transition over to John. And John, you have your regular spam report for us. Is that correct?
Yes, I do. So we'll just kind of quickly go over it here. So this is, and I'm changing things up a little bit. Some new terminology that's probably more appropriate. So this is, I'm calling it, instead of the spam malware report, I'm going to call it the unsolicited bulk email summary, because that's really what it is, right? This is email addresses that we have provisioned that nobody should know about, but we're receiving emails there. And so it's completely unsolicited, and these are the types of emails we're getting in here. But and then I've also split it out into two new sections here to kind of look at it in a more granular aspect. In terms of how many spams we're seeing the past 7 days, about the same, about 780,000 or so, 790,000. The ones without attachments, so we have the majority fall into this category, about 756,000 or so, are these general spams, 419 scams where a long-lost prince wants to give you money, fish scams where they're trying to get your personal information, or we just can't figure it out. It could just be anything. Could be legitimate, well, not legitimate spam, but advertising-type spam for various companies and organizations. And then we have ones that look like or probably have links inside that would be highly suspicious. Either there's a link right in the email pointing to an executable or a zip or some other type of malicious type attachment. And just to be clear, this is not an attachment in the email, but just a link in the email. So we're kind of taking a closer look at it now. We only see a very small number of those, but when you do see them, it's probably pretty obvious that something's afoot. We'll take a look at a couple of those real quickly. And then in terms of with attachments, we've looked at this before. Total number of spams that we saw come in with attachments, about 27,000, but only about 4,604 were actually unique. So there's a lot of repeated spams, which is, that's kind of normal that we're going to get a bunch of them into different email accounts. And in terms of spams with blocked malicious attachments, about 586. That's about what we saw before last week. And spams with unblocked with very suspect or potentially malicious attachments in them, about 2,800. Actually, that's kind of high. A bunch slipped through the automatic antivirus scanning that's built into the email delivery agents.
So perhaps hopefully I'm not stealing your thunder here, John, but are some of those consequences, some of those URL shortening tricks that are going on? For which one? Number 5 here, the spams with unblocked? I don't think so. Okay. Because those kind of fall under this category up here with suspicious links. We have seen a big run on these URL shortening ones. Maybe I'll try to cover that next week. Okay. But we've seen where they use like bit.ly or goo.gl, which is Google's URL shortener, and it's they put links to those in the email. If you click that link, it redirects you to a place that might even redirect you to another place that actually has some malicious drive-by type of exploit. We've seen a lot of black hole exploit kit type of pages being as the ultimate landing place where you end up, where you get infected. Just by clicking that link in the email, you'll get infected by the various exploits that the web page tries to exploit. Okay, forgive me, I should have been paying closer attention here. That is clearly the 2,893 that you have there are ones with attachments, not ones with links. But yeah, I personally would be interested in hearing more about how that redirection is done and how users, if somebody gets one of those emails, that they can get a little better idea whether it is malicious or not without getting, becoming a victim of it.
Right. Yeah, we'll try to cover that next week. I'll try to remember to do that.
Great.
In terms of general volumes, things are pretty much the same as we normally see. I have a breakdown of the various types of attachments we see in the emails. Nothing dramatically different, I don't think. Nothing noticeable to me, at least. In terms of the general spam that we see, nothing real new here. We've seen all these before, but as I said, these are all just general types of emails. Obviously, there's tons more that I can't put on a page, but I'm not going to bore everybody with every single subject line that we saw. But these are the general ones that don't really look like they have any obvious malicious intent in them, but they may. But in general, they're probably more just general spam, advertising, phishing, etc. So this is a category I wanted to point out, which I haven't before. These are links inside certain spams. It's not an attachment, just a link that's put into the email itself that if you click on it, will take you to a place that's obviously malicious. So one at the top here that we saw the most of, and we actually covered this last week. We looked at a sample of this. We're still seeing a lot of this egreetings.exe malware. Don't open it. Pretending to be a Hallmark e-card. Don't click on those. We saw there's a couple of other ones, I think, down here and down here at a couple of different locations. So just be wary of that. But as you can see, there's lots of cases of this where there's definitely some dodgy types of links being placed in the email that would be very troubled if you clicked on them automatically. So email security update, not quite sure, but the fact that it's hanging out at a .co.cc domain makes me highly suspicious. But then there's a lot of other ones here. I'm not going to go over all of them, but they're obviously not looking very legitimate. Mail delivery failed, returning message to sender. Now, why would I get an executable in a response on an email that was supposed to have failed being sent? So if we took a closer look at these, we'd probably find it's pretty obvious that there's malware inside there. Moving along to the emails with attachments. What was that, Jim?
I just, wow, looking at that graph.
Yeah. So, I think some people weren't here last week. This is kind of a continuing trend from last week. So this is what we're seeing in terms of attachments that were in emails that we received, but they were the attachment was detected as malicious and was removed before it was delivered to the user. Smoller has a huge campaign running. I forget the actual subject lines. We'll go take a look at that one because that was probably the most important. It's been last week and this week, leaps and bounds, sending lots and lots of these out. I think it might be FedEx they're purporting to be, more of that FedEx type stuff. I have to double check. We're seeing some others. InfoSteal is another one that's kind of creeped up at 8%. And there's this suspicious MH690, which is actually, I think, might be smaller as well. We can kind of tell by looking at the subject lines, and you kind of see if they're the same. But it might be an earlier detection before it got an official detection. And we've talked about that before as well. Some other things, we looked at a PDF JavaScript one last week as well. That's another one that I recommend people be careful of. A lot of people seem to think PDFs are not malicious, or they can't be. They can't infect the computer by opening them. Well, they certainly can, so be careful. And otherwise, pretty much the same old story that we're normally seeing, although, as we said, Smoller the past 2 weeks has been really amped up with a large run of spam.
So, John, before we go on here, I had a very quick question. I've read in a couple of places, perhaps we can hit on this next week as well, but I've heard the Wolodeck is back, but not necessarily as a spammer so much as it had been, but more of an information stealer. If I understand correctly, that was one that propagated through spam propagation. Have we seen any signs of that?
Not that I'm aware of, but I haven't really, this week I haven't had a chance to really look at a lot of the samples. Wolodeck was one that was a spam-based one, as I recall as well. So I would not be surprised to see a new variant of that come out doing that kind of thing, and maybe these InfoStealer ones are even related to that. I would have to go double-check that and see if that's the case.
Okay. Well, that's the only reason I brought that up. Sometimes these new, these press items come out or somebody's blog. They claim it's Wolodeck, based on some characteristics that it had done before. There may, in fact, be some code that's shared from the previous one. But the point was, that, first of all, was Wolodeck had presumably been taken down, so this is sort of a reincarnation of that at the very least. The new feature associated with their objective was that it was an information stealer, so perhaps trying to compete with Zeus or SpyEye along those lines. But just thought I'd bring it up, perhaps to seed some things that we should take a look at in the next week or so.
Okay. Yeah, I'll try to take a look at that as well as the URL shortener. We'll maybe cover that in a little bit more detail.
Cool.
In terms of block spam, I'm not going to go over all these either. There's nothing real new from previous weeks in terms of subject lines. We have seen, which I mentioned last week, these are some new ones going on, these PDF JavaScripts that are malicious. Be careful. And there's this emit one, which I don't think we've ever seen before. We've just seen a few of these, and I'm not quite sure what this detection is. I would have to go check.
I kind of like those ones. I have to admit, that would be kind of compelling, getting something that says, I hope you can handle the situation with this naked photo of yours.
Oh, I didn't even notice that one.
Yeah, I think the knee-jerk reaction would be, what the heck, where is that?
Yeah.
So be careful of those kinds of things as well.
Yeah, we've seen this tactic before where they will send an attachment that said, I found this picture of you naked or in a compromising situation. It probably works for some people, probably more than getting the, you should check this or some other kind of not as intuitive that it's about me.
I have the tendency to read between the lines on some of these. Some of them seem to be targeting businesses. Some of them seem to be targeting individuals. And I think there are organizations that have specific targets in mind when they do these sorts of things. If you're trying to get access to a teenager, particularly one that perhaps is on a mobile device, that would be the naked photo thing might work better than perhaps some of these others. But nevertheless, I digress.
It's okay. And I just wanted to double-check. The smaller ones that we have been seeing do all look FedEx or shipping-related types of subject lines. So we've talked about that before. Just be careful. We did see a couple of ones. I didn't get a chance to take a look at these. A Trojan WebKit one, which I'm not quite sure what that is, but these look a little interesting. Looks like some kind of flight numbers, maybe purporting that there was, your flight's been changed or something, and you need to look at it. That might be an interesting one to take a closer look at as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's all I really have for this week related to the spam probe reports. So I guess I'll throw it back to you, Brian.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and quickly cover our weather report. And I noticed that there was an error on my view graph, so I was correcting those while you were eloquently going through your report. And we'll go ahead and talk about some of these things. I don't have view graphs for all of these because some of them are just not particularly interesting to take a look at, but we have a few that we will. First of all, we've seen a lot of denial of service activity on DNS lately. Now, we mentioned a couple of times in this program already today about DNS amplification attacks. This first item here is not DNS amplification attacks, but it does appear to be flooding attacks against DNS servers, particularly authoritative DNS servers, and it appears to be basically a flood of requests. So this isn't a case where they're trying to flood the DNS servers with too many bytes. It looks like they're trying to flood it or load it down with requests. I have no idea what the content of those requests are, but we'll take a look at that in terms of a volumetric profile to just give you an idea of what's going on there. The next two items, this ICMP Type 3, IP Protocol 47, the only conclusion I'm able to make about that is that we should raise our threshold. So we're getting a lot of alerts here. They don't appear to be security related, so we're going to do something to get those off the board. And the next one, even this 41170. This was it's 41170 UDP. It was based on the number of source IP addresses. I don't think I have a view graph on that one, but basically it looks like probing in terms of the way we detect it, but the activity itself is more like P2P activity, and that appears to be innocuous. Although there is some, perhaps I do in fact have a view graph on this one, but yeah, I do. There are some interesting patterns associated with that, so I want to point it out that I am a little bit, just want to be a little sensitive. So it does have the yellow caution flag associated with it. Next one is UDP port 16402. This one is innocuous. It's simply a growth of activity, particularly associated with iChat. I think there's a view graph on that. We'll just look at it really briefly. The next two items, ICMP type 0 and ICMP type 11. Let me take a quick look here. Yeah, I don't have, I do have the one for ICMP type 0. We'll take a quick look at that. And, but it does not appear to be anything of significance that we should be concerned about, but it does have some interesting profile. ICMP type 11, similar kind of situation. So we'll go ahead and jump down to 3389. That is increase in probes on sources, source IP addresses. We've talked about this before. I'll just show you what's going on. There has been some spurious and increased activity associated with that. TCP port 8090, increase in probes as well for that. This is a small number of sources that are doing that activity. And then last but not least, we'll look at UDP port 5060. So that was a long introduction, and we'll go ahead and take a look at some of these. First of all, what we're looking at in this particular graph is the difference in activity relative to what we expect in terms of the number of packets per second on DNS, that is using a destination port 53 UDP. It may or may not, in fact, be going to a DNS server. It may not be DNS traffic necessarily. This is from a network point of view. But what we're seeing in this case are denial of service attacks. That is the large upward spikes that we see here. Example here, here, and here. All of these are denial of service attacks against a variety of different U.S.-based targets. I don't know the motivation behind those attacks. Some of them appear to be DNS servers, so certainly if you're running a DNS server and we're targeted by this, you want to probably get some help with mitigating that. And, the volume here can be on the order of, well, in some cases peaking up around 500,000 packets per second. So, most DNS servers aren't going to be able to handle that by themselves. They're going to need some kind of way to help filter that out. And like I said, they appear to, from a packet size point of view, to be legitimate DNS requests, but I don't have specific insight into the content associated with those. The next one that I thought I'd show you here, this is, again, is one that I feel is innocuous, but the one thing that is kind of notable is that there has been an upward trend in activity. In particular, we had sort of a low baseline of the number of sources that were participating in this. As of January 25th of this year, there's been a significant upward trend. Now, I suspect this might be some sort of a new P2P application that's become popular. Port 41170 was previously associated with Blubster. There's a chance this is associated with Blubster, but I'd be surprised if this many new users were going on board with Blubster. But all of the characteristics that are observable here basically are consistent with point-to-point kind of traffic. There's basically a lot of consumer participation, common packet sizes. The source and destination ports are the same in this particular case. So I don't see it as a security threat, but certainly a significant change. We just keep a little bit of an eye on it to make sure that it's not going to be a significant issue. Next item, as I mentioned, 16402 UDP. Again, this is P2P activity. In particular, this port's associated with iChat, which is Apple's chat service that they've launched recently, and we're looking at the past 180 days of activity. There has been a sort of a continuing upward trend on that, and so it shows up in our anomalies as basically an upward trend. Again, innocuous. Next item was that is associated with ICMP 0. Now, ICMP 0 is echo response. That is, if you send a ping, the response will come back, a ping request, that is. If you send a ping request, the response will come back as an ICMP 0 packet. And what we've seen here is back around January 25th timeframe, sort of a large increase in the number we're looking specifically at the number of sources that were doing ICMP 0 responses, and it's sort of flattened off since then, but still at a higher level than we've traditionally seen. And I think there are a combination of things going on here. One is that there are P2P applications, including gaming, for example, that will use ICMP ping requests and responses as a means to check the availability of other devices that they're participating with. So that may be one of the explanations associated with this. And but there are some denial of service attack activities associated with this as well. That is, sometimes if a denial of service attack is launched against a target using ICMP requests, that is ping requests, the responses would come back as ICMP 0, and we'd see an increase in volume. So, and then there's also scanning activity that takes place on the network using ICMP ping requests or echo requests, and the responses will come back in that manner the same way. So all of those, I think, in combination are the explanation for some of these changes. Some innocuous, some not so innocuous. Next one is, we've reported on this many times, as I've mentioned. This is an increase in the number of sources scanning on port 3389. That's a remote desktop protocol. As we've mentioned many times, this is basically remote access into a computer, sometimes used to get into an enterprise for being able to get access to your desktop from perhaps a mobile device or another computer, a home computer, for example. Now, this is the probing activity looking for available RDP accessible machines on the internet. There are a number of sources obviously contributing to this and off and on, and that is a very strong indicator of a botnet that is someone that's controlling a number of bots and telling them to go out and scan for these devices. We see very abrupt increases and very abrupt decreases in that activity, which is a very strong indicator of botnet. And this is varying between, just a few hundred devices that are doing it on the low side up to a peak of around 4,500 that we detect in our scanning activity in this little peak that's right here. And then sort of the high average that we've seen over the last few weeks has been around somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 sources that are doing that scanning activity. Significance here, same stories before. There are organizations out there that are probing for remotely accessible devices, perhaps to conduct other nefarious activities or to steal information from the machines that are accessible. Generally, to our knowledge, they're doing password guessing attacks, but there may be other exploits that they're taking advantage of as well. So our general advice is don't expose RDP to the internet unless you absolutely have to, and if you have to, make sure you're using strong authentication. Next item, port 8090. Now, this was a new one for me. I think we posted an Internet Protect alert on this earlier. Perhaps I think it was actually, in fact, a couple weeks ago on February 15th or so. This is an increase in scan probes. That is, we only see a few sources doing this. I think it was, in fact, about 5 sources that we picked up. And this is an application called Vontu that I believe is currently owned by Symantec. That is, they were bought. And if I remember correctly, this has something to do with DLP, that is data leakage protection. Now, why somebody would be targeting this particular application is not clear to me. I don't know for certain that that's the application that they're targeting. But there is some increase in the probing activity on this particular port, multiple IP addresses contributing to that, and you want to sort of pay attention to it. The addresses are located in China, France, and the United States in order of sort of the significance of that activity. Next item, this is the last one on the list in terms of the ports. This is scan probes on port 5060 UDP, and that's the session initiation protocol that's used for voice over IP. Basically, it's the call control for voice over IP. Now, two things that I want to point out here. One is that you can see there's a very abrupt change in activity starting on, I guess this was January 30th. This is not necessarily a bad thing here. Basically, this was a point where we made what I would describe as a significant improvement in our processing algorithms, our scan detection algorithm on our processing platform. So now we're doing a better job at scanning or detecting scanning activity on this particular port. And the significance of that is that, you know, there were some characteristics that were missing before, obviously. So there hasn't necessarily been a change in the level of scanning activity that we're picking up here. You can see that there have been some spikes and off points since then. But generally speaking, what we want to recognize is that there are, you know, organizations that are out there looking for VoIP gateways that they can take advantage of, either to exploit the platform and perhaps, you know, execute premium calling charges against those. There are, in fact, organizations that will set up a premium charging service. They can facilitate this through certain countries that will basically allow this kind of thing in some respects. And then on the back side, if they can break into a voice processing platform, basically a call platform, a PBX, for example, start initiating lots of those calls, those charges get billed back to the organization that's been compromised, and the attackers are able to pick up revenue on the backside of those premium charges. And that initiates a fraud investigation, and so understanding who these people are that are scanning for these platforms is one of the things that's of interest. So,
I was going to say the victim might not even know that anything's happened until they get their bill, you know, roughly a month later or something. You know, on that note, we've talked about this type of attack before and this type of activity, but probably not in a while. There is a lot of good tools out there that the hackers have to probe for voice PBXs and hack into them. They work really well. I've looked at a few of them. And I actually had a call last week with some people outside the company that were experiencing a lot of fraud related to this type of activity. So if you do have a VoIP PBX, you know, I don't know that a lot of people are monitoring it. I think a lot of people put these PBXs out there, and they don't really have a lot of instrumentation around logging and what's going on there. They just assume it runs and it's carrying their phone calls fine until the day happens that they get broken into and all these, you know, fraudulent calls go through their PBX. So.
Yeah, good point, John, and I think that's sort of the objective here. One of the reasons we wanted to make sure we improved the algorithm so that we can detect these attackers in the early process, and also to help make folks a little more aware that this is a target platform that they go after, and there are reasons they do it that they can monetize that we'd like to be able to prevent. Okay, so just to sort of close things up here, what we talked about so far were sort of what we detect as anomalies in terms of network activity. This is looking at the probing activity, that is the scanning activity that's taking place somewhat regularly. As usual, port 445 is at the top of the list. There are some other regulars, port 1433 TCP, associated with databases. There is one, this is relatively new. This was associated with McAfee, their rumors application. That is a P2P application for deploying updated signatures. This is on port 6515. We reported on this some time ago. The vulnerability associated with this, basically the platforms with this vulnerability could be used as an anonymous proxy for doing spamming, for example, and the patches have apparently been pushed out, but perhaps the attackers aren't aware of that. So that scanning activity is continuing. I'm hoping that there aren't latent vulnerable systems out there, but if you are running McAfee, particularly their Roomies application, you want to pay attention to it. 3389 TCP, we already talked about that. That's RDP, routinely scanned. Port 22 SSH and port 23 Telnet, again, routinely scanned for password guessing attacks. And port 3306, again, as with 1433, which is Microsoft SQL, port 3306, which is MySQL database. Both of them are targets. And then last but not least, port 80, web activity, or basically the web servers are a target as well. So that's the most probed ports. And then in terms of the most sources that are doing that probing, again, 445, this is still, you know, lots of configure infections and then botnets that mimic that sort of behavior. We talked about port 23, 3389. Some of these are innocuous, which would be the 3074, 41170. Both of those are innocuous. And then we see some others. Can somebody refresh my memory? I forget. I don't recall 1562. Well, forgive me for that. I don't know what 1562 is off the top of my head, but it is on the radar. You want to pay attention to that one if you're using that port. And port 80 and port 139. And as Ed mentioned earlier, there is a lot of scanning activity on on ICMP 8, which is echo request, and that shows up consistently in terms of the number of sources that are scanning. These are oftentimes blended, what they call blended threats. That is, you know, they're just looking for a host using a ping, and then once they find a host that responds to a ping, they'll scan the ports on that host to identify what port services are accessible from the internet. So I think that covers the report for today. Any other last comments from the group here? All right, so just a few closing remarks here. First of all, if you want to contact us, you can contact us at cyberthreat@list.att.com. Send us email. Jim Clausing and I both have blogs as well. You can look at our blogs at the Networking Exchange at the AT&T website for that. And you can reach this program from the Tech Channel, AT&T Tech Channel. That's techchannel.att.com. You can also reach it as a podcast from iTunes or from YouTube. Just search for the AT&T Cyber Threat Report. And on the AT&T Tech Channel page, there is a new feature in place. A number of people have asked for this in the past. They were interested in looking at certain segments of the program and weren't able to scroll forward. Now the videos are posted as a streaming video, so you now can scroll forward to the segments that you want. And we're making a point to include some timestamps on the segments as a part of the index so that you can find out what segment of the program that you'd like to look at most. And another thing is we're going to try to make a point to do a quick summary of the program and get that posted out on our Networking Exchange blog for the on the AT&T website as well. So another way that you can subscribe to get insight into what's going on with the program. And with that, I want to thank you for watching today or listening, whichever it is. Thank you, Jim and John, for joining today. And on behalf of all of us here, keep your network safe.